Welcome back to my corner of the garage. Today we're going to be building a pretty straightforward crosscut sled for my new table saw. Now, I had one for my old DeWalt that I just recently sold after upgrading to this new compact saw stop. And I liked some of the features of it, didn't like some of the others, so I am incorporating the ones that I did like in this one while simplifying some things that weren't really of use in the last one. I am simply laminating up some 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood. I only had 1/2 inch on hand, and I really wanted to make it out of Baltic birch plywood. It just looks nicer and, have fewer voids. So I'm just laminating some pieces together to basically get 1 inch pieces for the front and the back. And so I'm just gluing these together. I've got a saw stop, so I don't want any brad nails or anything in here. So I'm just using wood glue and then going to clamp the snot out of these. You can see I'm using a long level here, so it's nice and flat. My new workbench top is nice and flat, and so I'm just trying to ensure just as flat of a reference as possible to keep these perfectly flat and in line for this crosscut sled. I'm cutting some pieces here for what's going to be kind of a blade guard on the back side, and I'm actually going to cut 3 pieces of this and laminate those together at this time. While I'm gluing this up, I want to go ahead and kind of give a disclaimer to this build. This is not just the quick, easiest crosscut sled out there. Actually, David Picciuto from Make Something just put a video out, and I think his words were, this is a quick and dirty crosscut sled. So if you want a super easy one to throw together, I'll put a link to his video if you haven't seen that already. But this is also not the fanciest out there. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles. So here at the moment, let me get back into the build video. You see the play there in a 3/4 inch piece of material. And so to make some runners, I need to cut down some material so that will really sit in those miter tracks, just really, really snugly. And a little bit of an aside, I've just started using this table saw. I'm using the stock saw stop blade, which I think is like a 24 tooth, and it leaves a pretty gnarly edge. It's more for construction. So I am going to my go-to saw blades. I had this in my old table saw. I use the CMT line, and I really like this 40 tooth for the table saw. I've got another CMT blade in my miter saw as well as my track saw. And here in just a minute, you'll see a much finer finish, and it cuts through material like butter. This is poplar, so it's really not giving it much of a workout, but I've been cutting a lot of white oak, and it really gives it a workout with it only being a compact table saw, but the blade just really does a good job. So just tapping the fence to dial it in till I can get a nice snug fit. It's a little too snug, so one more taparoo, and I can get that right where I need to without any play, but can still move freely. So back to the build a little bit. Once again, this is not the quick and easiest crosscut sled out there, and it's definitely not the fanciest. There are some with, so many features with attachments and removable pieces and things like that. This is really for me to make just your standard 90-degree crosscuts that I wouldn't feel safe doing otherwise, or just using a miter gauge for. Going to have a stop block, but it's not even going to have measuring tape like I did on my old one. I tended to just, mark my workpiece. So if I can give any, ideas to those out there looking to build kind of a middle of the road crosscut sled, hopefully you glean a few, ideas from this, but that's really the purpose of this, and thought I'd document it just as I've put out a couple of recent, shop upgrades, pieces of shop furniture. So this is really just kind of in line with that now that I've got my new workbench and table saw. It's time to get a nice flat reference edge now that those glued up laminated pieces are definitely not flat together. So going to get these cleaned up on one edge first, and you can see that's looking really nice and clean. So I can do that, and then get the long front and back pieces same way. Basically going to clean those up, so then I can now take them over to the table saw and clean up the other edge and get them nice and perpendicular. here I am just routing out a big channel for a T-track that's gonna, sit on the top of this. Is gonna be I guess the back rail. T-track's gonna hold the stop block, and so I'm just hogging out a bunch of the material right now. I think it's to its final depth, but I'm gonna do a couple of passes. My router bit's not quite wide enough for the T-track. And here I'm actually gonna be running the piece through the opposite way, and I always get people, freaking out when I do this, but this is actually not a climb cut because you can see where the router bit's placed. The material's on the other side, closest to the fence. So you actually have to run it through opposite, or you're doing a climb cut. So got this nice and dialed in. I'm going to go ahead and here in just a moment, I'm putting a round over on both sides just so it has a nice smooth, to the touch round over where your hands are going to be right there by the T-track. I'm trimming up the rails now, and because I've got the aluminum T-track in, I put one of my old miter saw blades in. You can use your normal woodworking blades. I just am always fearful I'm going to dull my nice ones faster, so I just put an old one in and flushed that up. And then here on what's going to be the front fence or front rail, this is just I'm knocking off the corners. Again, fewer sharp angles to make it easier to manhandle and grab and move around. So then after I knock off these corners, I'll just put a light chamfer, actually sorry, a light round over. I think it's an 1/8 inch round over on this. So again, it's just nice and soft to the touch. If you take nothing else away from this video, this is super important. Put a 45-degree chamfer on what's going to be the front part of this back rail, what your workpiece sits up against. And this allows for sawdust, some place for the sawdust to go on repeating cuts, because a little piece of sawdust can really skew your nice and dialed in crosscut sled. So that chamfer just simply allows a place for some sawdust to go without it affecting your workpiece and it getting a little skewed. So always put that in just right where that workpiece is going to go on that front side. And here I am cutting down the blade guard to its final dimensions, putting a light chamfer around it, again, just kind of soften the touch of it. And it's just about time to start assembling all together. Here's a simple trick that'll save you some headaches in the future. I started with my fence all the way over and then nudged it in, and that will give me a flat reference for this crosscut sled, this bottom piece, to sit up against during this glue up for these runners underneath. And what that will do is that will ensure that whenever you go to put your crosscut sled on, if you throw your fence over to the farthest position, it's going to fit for sure. I'm just putting in some nuts in the miter tracks at this point, so that way when I set the runners on them, they're kind of protruding up from the table a little bit, so that the crosscut sled, that bottom piece, has full contact on those runners. But then once those are out of there, they'll move freely. I'm using a combination of wood glue and CA glue. The CA glue just kind of acts like a clamp in that it dries much faster than the wood glue, which is going to have an even stronger bond. Now, I am not actually going to attach these runners with screws at all. I'm simply relying on the glue, putting some clamping pressure with a heavy scroll saw in there, and then a little bit later I can take that off and flip it over. Now, like I said, I'm not attaching screws under there. I feel confident that the glue is going to just keep it in place fine. But I guess if down the road, one comes loose, I can reattach it and put some screws in. And I'm just using a blade to clean out any glue squeeze out. And now I can start assembling what's kind of the front fence on there. And this will give it some more stability. And then I'll make a cut here in just a minute after I clamp this down, let it dry for a bit. Before I make the first cut, I want to get this moving more freely. A lot of friction going on right now. It slides, but it's pretty stiff. So just using a card scraper here on the edges to just sand off a little bit of material. Probably wouldn't have to use a card scraper. I just like it because it's a perfect 90-degree angle. Using some wax now to wax these runners. I'm going to go ahead and put some on the bottom of the sled as well, just to reduce some of the friction, since my worktop, my outfeed is wood as well. So putting a little bit on both the runners and the bottom, and I was actually pleasantly surprised how well this thing slid. I mean, it about flew off the table when I gave it a good shove. Whoa, that works amazingly well. Don't mind my crazy boys in the background who are also working on their workbenches, but I have marked a line just past the center point of the blade and marking that here on the side so I can see it. Because I've got a router lift system and some T-tracks in the tabletop, I basically have a limited amount of space that my Crosscut sled can travel forward. So I'm just making sure that my fence there is for sure in front of that line I marked, so that my blade can pass over, the highest point of the blade is for sure going to pass to that fence. And so I'm not going to, miss a part of the cut because I couldn't get my table saw or my Crosscut sled all the way through. This is a design feature that's strictly aesthetic, but I guess it does reduce a little bit of the weight of an already pretty heavy sled. And I'm just removing the material from behind the fence up to where that blade guard is going to be. And it does make it a little less cumbersome to work with, as far as, just not having jagged corners sticking out. It'll make a little bit more sense as I assemble. You can kind of already tell there that it's a little bit easier to work around. But I'm making this first cut so that I have a reference to be able to square this back fence against where the actual blade is coming in. I'm clamping the fence in place roughly right now, but then flip it over, and I'm putting one screw in as a pivot point on one side, which then now when I take it back over to the table saw, I can pivot that fence along that screw. I'm going to get some machinist squares out for both sides, and you can kind of see I'm nudging that till I can get it nice and true. And this honestly took me a couple of tries. I put a screw in, and I guess in the whole process of screwing it together, something moved a little bit. So I actually had to do this a couple of times. But here you can see once I had it in place, and maybe it happened when I was clamping, but something got a little off. So now I'm just putting a screw on the other side, and that will, ensure it's not going to move. But like I said, this took me a couple tries. I didn't show each try till I really dialed it in. I did not use the 5-cut method. There are a lot of videos on YouTube that show that. Like I said, for my purposes, those machinist squares really got it nice and square in the end. Here I am putting some corner clamps to keep the back fence perpendicular to the sled while I attach this blade guard. And don't do what I did right here. You don't really want to put glue on the front part that's going to attach to the fence, because then you can't move the fence and dial it in later. So in hindsight, I would have just glued the bottom part to the sled itself, but it is what it is. Just don't do what I did. Here's my kind of hack for putting in angles at the drill press. I just put in a little scrap piece in the back, and what I'm doing is this is going to go on my French cleat wall. This is a holder for the Crosscut sled. And so I'm going to be putting some dowels in at a slight angle so that I can drill some corresponding holes in the Crosscut sled itself, and it will hang up on the French cleat. Alright, now I get to use my crosscut sled to make a simple stop block out of some scrap walnut. This part, in hindsight, I cut a little too deep. You don't have to actually make that big of a cut, but I'm just kind of tapping this into place. This is going to be the part that rides in the T-track, and like I said, I don't need that to sit that low. I'll fix that later, but it is nice and snug. It's not going to rack at all. And now I can once again use the crosscut sled to trim up that little piece that sits on the T-track. Here I am drilling out the hole for the bolt that's actually going to go into the T-track itself. I'm fixing my mistake now and just trimming off that excess, so that it just has a slight ridge on it to sit in the T-track, but still allows it to tighten down fully. Just putting a little paste wax on there for some protection, plus love to see that walnut grain pop, and it lets it slide nice and freely here on the T-track. And I gotta assemble it now and give it a whirl, and you'll really see it slides and glides along really smoothly. Going to give a bit of a demo now of the crosscut sled, and as you can see there on my outfeed, I've got a router lift, and I purposefully have these positive stops in place, so the crosscut sled can only go so far, and those stops are really important. As you'll see here, it can only stop and go so far, and that really makes sure your blade doesn't go beyond that blade enclosure while still getting the full depth of cut of your table saw blade. Thanks for sticking with me till the end. Hope to see you on the next video, which may very well be this coaster build video.